Welcome to Renegade Inc, the show which allows us to think differently. The linguist and political activist Noam Chomsky said that the standard technique of privatisation is defund to make sure that things don't work, so people get angry, then you can hand it over to private capital. If you want to see this process at work, just look at how successive British governments since the 80s have treated the National Health Service. The NHS was the first universal healthcare system established in the world. The founding principle was simple: comprehensive universal healthcare, free at the point of delivery. But predictably, very quickly, the NHS became a political football, shaped by the governing party's economic beliefs. But there was always something else at play behind the party politics. So on this show, we ask what that was, and where next for the national treasure that is the National Health Service. Is it now time to ask a different question about the NHS? Is universal healthcare just too important to be politicised? And do the British people really want a healthcare system that is held hostage by the profit motive? Joining me to discuss the future of the NHS and how we can influence it are the campaigner and producer of the documentary The Great NHS Heist, Dr. Bob Gill, and the qualified doctor and NHS campaigner, Dr. Sarah Gangoli. Welcome to you both. Thank you for coming by on such an important issue. Sarah, when you look at the NHS today, what do you see?
I see an NHS which is suffering from decades of neoliberal attempts to privatise it. And I don't apologise for saying that, and I don't think it's overly alarmist to say that. From 1979, with the advent of the neoliberal era in this country, the NHS has been progressively fragmented, sold off, undermined. The staff have lost their professional autonomy. And we now come to the stage where we are in the final stages of that road to full privatisation. We have the 2012 Health and Social Care Act, which essentially reduces NHS to a logo. We have attempts to sell off NHS assets, and we have the development of the 5-year forward view, which details the production of STPs, Sustainable Transformation Pathways, which were discussed in the 1988 document, The Health of Nations, published by the Adam Smith Institute. So we have witnessed a programme of progressive privatisation by stealth. The NHS is beloved. The NHS is our most precious public service, a wonderful example to the world. And to privatise it overnight would cause absolute outcry. What they've had to do is they've had to build a narrative around their intentions of the deserving and the undeserving sick, the deserving and the undeserving staff members, in order to produce this result by stealth.
You can almost hear, Bob, when Sarah talks like that, you can almost hear the people who are in favour of this privatisation saying, this is all conspiracy theory, the market knows best, and actually we haven't had this grand plan at all, we've just been trying to get the efficiency in and market efficiency. When you see the NHS, what do you see? Well,
we're in the home straight, as Sarah says. We're in the defunding and the destabilisation phase. The NHS is now being engineered to collapse, and famously Noam Chomsky says, defund, make people angry, hand over to private capital. Well, we're in the making people angry phase. Services are overstretched. We've got the lowest number of doctors per head of population in Europe. Similarly, very low bed numbers. And I'm struggling to get my patients admitted to hospital. It's very dangerous. It's very dispiriting for the staff. And we're having an exodus of NHS doctors.
The brain drain is phenomenal. And you think that that is because people are being so badly disenfranchised because, frankly, they don't have the resource, the time or the care to be able to do their jobs. Is that a fair depiction?
Absolutely, and it's absolutely by design. This is no accident. Not only are they being forced into situations which they feel are potentially dangerous for patients, they compromise their professional integrity occasionally by having to deliver what they see as substandard care, and also through various bits of legislation such as modernising medical careers, which was brought in the late 2000s. Doctors in particular have lost their professional autonomy. It was said by a Secretary of State that they wanted an NHS filled with doctors fit for purpose. Doctors at that point ceased to be whole professionals and became a set of competencies. So you have to have competencies signed off each year. It doesn't matter what level of seniority you are. And this not only creates disillusionment, it creates stress because very often these annual appraisals are used to intimidate people who have, for example, reported problems, people who are having problems in their personal lives. But it also creates a paper trail so that people can be scrutinised if anything should occur later on.
What's the purpose of that? There seems to be a pattern here. There's testing and measurement, which is a sort of very management consultant way of going about things. In all these privatised industries, if you think about the post service, if you think about the utilities, if you think about telecoms, rail, if you begin to think about banking, now look at what's happened in education. Yes. It's test, 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 test. And now we've got competent doctors being tested to within an inch of their life. Why?
If you want to build a compliant workforce, the best way to do that is to demoralise a workforce. And what better way to do that than to constantly make them feel that they are not and cannot do a good job?
It's deeply cynical.
Of course.
But very effective.
Yes.
And the end game is?
Privatisation.
We keep coming back to it. You mentioned that you can't get your patients into hospital. And we caught up with one of them, Janet Butler. Can we just have a quick look at this VT and get your reaction to it?
I felt unwell. I went to the hospital. I'd got jaundice. I had some blood tests done there. Got told to go away. I went back. Got told there's no bed, so go home. I got admitted to another hospital. Told I've got pancreatic cancer. It's incurable. It's spread all up the blood vessels. And I've had no chemo. I'm still waiting to hear about chemo. I've got to have a stent put in my kidney. I've had a stent put in my bile gland. And it's just a waiting game all the time. And waiting. I've still not heard about chemo and it's nearly 3 months later. It just makes me feel, it makes me feel angry because I've never been ill like this before. This is the first time anything like this has happened to me. And you just think, you're paying for this, you work, you pay for this, and you can't even get into an hospital. The doctors and nurses that are treating me, some of them will tell you to speak up, but they won't speak up for you because they're scared. They're scared what will happen to them, and they don't want to be in trouble, like they could lose their job over it. So they're telling the patients to actually speak up for themselves, so that they, because they know what's going on is wrong, but they just have to grin and bear it, and they just tell the patients, you need to say something, because nothing will get done for you otherwise. It's all about, oh, let's cause chaos and try and get everyone to go private. I think that's what it is. They want everybody to start going private.
You've treated Janet, and that story is harrowing. How much of what she says there do you stand by?
It took 3 attempts to get her admitted. She was as yellow as a canary, feeling sick, and was told by doctors that she saw, there are no beds. And then other doctors came along and said, well, you're fit enough to go home. This is absolutely disgraceful in my view. I could not imagine when I was a junior doctor in hospital that I would ever be put in a situation where I would have to turn away sick people. Not only that, her history is clear. A medical student will tell you, this woman needs to be admitted. But the word came from higher up, there's no bed, get her out. So I am faced with, on a weekly basis, patients of mine not being able to access urgent care. It's very demoralising. Either I sit back and say nothing, or I try and speak out. Janet is extremely brave. There's many patients I've asked to go public. Not only are they fearful of their health, but they're fearful of repercussions. They're afraid that their care might get even worse. The other point she makes is staff are terrified of raising alarm bells. And we've spoken to many whistleblowers over the 2-3 years I've been campaigning. There's a recurrent theme. You have to weigh up losing your career, losing your livelihood, or doing the right thing for the patient. And most choose to protect their career.
Let's move this then out of the what's happening on the ground and move it to the political realm. The Naylor report is out. and the current Conservative government is following it to the letter. What is the Naylor report and what does it say about the NHS?
Okay, so the Naylor report was released this year, and it looks at the assets, so the estates of the National Health Service. The history of this is that with the 2012 Health and Social Care Act, the primary care trusts were abolished. And their land was essentially transferred to a private company for free, to a private limited company called NHS Property Services.
NHPS.
NHSPS, indeed. Now that represents about 11% of all the property of the NHS. The first recommendation of the Naylor report is the establishment of an NHS property board, which will absorb NHS Property Services and other similar companies. Now, it will control 100% of NHS property. So that's the first kind of alarming fact. The recommendation is that this is set up immediately in shadow form and in substantive form by April 2018. So they're in a little bit of a hurry.
Why are they in
with
such
this.
a rush?
Let's say this. Well, there are a number of theories. One of them, of course, is that Oliver Letwin said before the 2010 election result that within 5 years of a Conservative government, the NHS would not exist. So they're a little behind schedule. The second point that really stood out for me is that they have quoted a book value of 9 to 11 billion for NHS assets. They were asked to quote another figure, and they were specifically asked by the Department of Health to quote a figure which removed the planning risk, and they came up with a figure of 17 billion. Now this assumes that they'll run into absolutely no problems once this property is sold off, gaining planning permission to produce housing, which they say is one of the priorities of this sell-off. In particular, they say that this will be sold to property developers and housing associations to produce affordable housing for NHS staff, and they caveat that with if this is required.
It's an interesting little endnote.
But for me, reading this report, the most shocking part of it was that they wish to incentivise the sell-off of NHS assets by offering them 2 for 1.
What does this mean?
They'll be producing 2 for 1 offers on NHS assets.
The irony, it sounds like a supermarket.
It does.
And I think it was Griffiths, wasn't it, back in the 80s, who was head of Sainsbury's. And what did he recommend? He recommended that healthcare should be treated like a supermarket, and which is what? Stack it high, sell it cheap.
Well, what he was an instigator behind was the setting up of a bloated, top-down bureaucratic infrastructure across the public sector. They've been selling this myth of economic efficiency in healthcare. It's a complete lie. The market doesn't work in healthcare. You've got information asymmetry where the professional knows far more than the client or the consumer. And you've also got danger of provider-led demand where the doctor, because he knows you don't know what he's talking about, he can, if he so wishes, charge you for more procedures than you don't need. So it's inherently risky, it's inherently expensive. If you fund things publicly, you already have an infrastructure for collecting tax. You don't need a separate infrastructure to run a market. You don't need a separate infrastructure to run an insurance structure. So that is all got away with. Publicly delivered health services are far more efficient than any insurance-based or other model across the world. So that's a complete lie. The setup is a complete lie. But the Naylor report is really a asset stripper's charter.
Because all the evidence suggests that introducing the market into a healthcare system makes it more inefficient, it reduces the quality of patient care, it results in over-treatment and a certain amount of corruption as well. So marketising healthcare is ideological. It's certainly not evidence-based.
Cynically, in the Naylor report, there is a suggestion that hospitals shouldn't have access to public capital funding if those assets haven't been effectively disposed of. Now, I can't find a more cynical clause in any kind of recommendation. Your view?
Yeah, I mean, it also depends on what they're calling capital expenditure within the healthcare system, because I would certainly be including things like MRI scanners, CT scanners, large pieces of equipment. So hospitals are going to have to sell off their assets presumably then pay some form of rent. Otherwise, they don't get any funding for new scanners and new equipment. It's grotesque.
Which is a great place to leave the first half. It's all about the rent. It's all about the rent, ladies and gentlemen. But we'll be back in the second half with solutions and talking more about your wonderful film. Join us after this short break for more from Dr. Bob Gill and Dr. Sarah Gangoli. Welcome back to Renegade Inc, the show that allows us to think differently. Before we talk more with the NHS campaigners, Dr. Bob Gill and Dr. Sarah Gangoli, let's have a quick look at this week's Renegade Inc Index. We start with our favourite tweets. First up is from Dr. Phil Hammond. People with long-term illness may now be more worried about how to pay for their care and the standard of that care than the illness itself. What a mess. What a parlour state to be in. Next up from Dr. Ben White, you can probably see a theme here. Yet again, another advanced proposal for the NHS with apparently zero public consultation. Not sure how they get away with it. I mean, I'm agog. How do they keep getting away with it? Is it just apathy? Is it too complicated?
Well, in a democracy, you're supposed to have an independent media which reports what's going on, which analyses what's going on.
Oh, you're so utopian.
It's not happening. It's not happening. Why should it be down to people like us to leave our day job or try and squeeze the day job in somewhere?
Because it's not happening.
It's not happening.
Here's one from the NHS Roadshow. To be honest, doctors and nurses think that the biggest challenge we face in health and social care are Conservative Party policies. Never a truer word, really, when you've heard the absolute disaster of the first half of this show. And finally, from those wonderful people over at the Daily Mash, Hunt, that's Jeremy, of course, Hunt, jealous of hackers who were able to cripple the NHS in just 20 minutes. I mean, he's had a crack at it for about a decade, and they did it in 20. He must think, oh, can we hire them? Now, our books of the week this week, Bob, you've brought them in. And let's sell them. The first is Deadly Spin by Wendell Potter. Pray see it for us.
Wendell Potter is a former private health insurance insider from America. He was head of PR for the industry, and he's jumped to the other side. He's an advocate now for a single-payer system, which is something which means universal health care for Americans. And we've spoken to him about the tricks that the insurance industry do to make sure they keep hold of the American system. And I'm afraid they're using the same tricks in this country. So we've spoken to him for the film.
Fantastic. We'll talk about the film in a second. Deadly Spin by Wendell Potter. And you've got another one. And by the way, conscience doth make cowards of us all, right? He must have had some dark nights of the soul to come out. And ironically, the book's white. He's trying to cleanse himself of all that. Now, this book's dark, understandably. How corrupt is Britain? In a word?
Very.
Right.
Yeah, it's not obvious corruption, it's not extortive corruption, there isn't money changing hands, it's more collusive corruption and the revolving door. And we spoke to Professor David White, and I was particularly interested in his explanation of new public management, which is a setting up of the public sector to be privatised.
Thank you very much. Finally, let's have a quick look at this, which is the Great NHS Heist, which is your film. You're a doctor within the NHS. What was the inspiration to go out and put your head above the parapet and start making this?
What tipped me into action was a conversation with the chair of our CCG board.
What's a CCG?
Clinical Commissioning Group, which is a group of doctors supposedly making the decisions, but it couldn't be further from the truth. And I described to him the problems I was getting with patients accessing care and being turned out of hospital and ending up back in. And he said three things to me. First, he said, "You're too sensitive." Then he said, "My patients are just unlucky. He's not hearing this from anybody else." And the final straw was, "Why are you worried you're not paying for it?" I went home, I spoke to my wife, I said, "Look, I need to speak up. I cannot keep quiet anymore. This might jeopardize our career, it's our livelihood, but I can't carry on working."
What did she say?
She works at the surgery. She said, "I see it as well, you have to do it."
A lot of people wouldn't.
But actually it was like coming out of prison, because I knew what was going on and I just kept biting my lip. I knew from 2000 where this was going. At that point I realised, maybe I was ignoring it, that our governments are not working in the public interest. That's as basic as you can get. I, as a doctor, was seeing the impact of patients getting harmed, dying avoidably, and they were further progressing the cuts. I couldn't take any more.
Right. Let's get to the real root of this. What the government are doing is ideologically driven, and it's driven by a set of economic ideals that, let's face it, haven't really served the world very well in other areas. It's called neoliberalism. It's incredibly difficult to define because it's so formless. And when the public hear it, they go, God, that seems too complicated. I'm not sharp enough. I probably don't get it. How do you define it? And how do you define it related to medicine?
My interpretation of it is to let the market run wild and to remove protections or barriers to trade as they see it, but I see it as protections. And the end result is you end up with wealth accumulating at the top, and we're sold it by, don't worry, this will trickle down to you.
Is it just ideology driving this? Or, let me ask you, is there some really clever guy or girl behind the scenes pulling the strings?
There is plenty of documentation out there which makes clear that people like think tanks and individuals who've gone on to become politicians like Oliver Letwin and John Redwood, when they were working for the privatisation unit of N.M. Rothschilds back in the 80s, they wrote key documents we've talked about. One was Britain's biggest enterprise, where it sets out how to get from a public service to an insurance-based system without too many people noticing. It goes back a long way, but it's only when New Labour and the Conservatives agreed that this is the direction they wanted to take the country, then you didn't have this rebalancing, and now we've got free market ruling.
If we remain complacent, where do you see the logical progression of this issue?
You will get a very much shrunken public provision. You will have skid row public services. In order to replace what the NHS no longer provides, you've got two choices. Either you pay out of pocket or you take insurance. Both ways, you're completely in the hands of the insurance industry. They will look after you when you're relatively well and cheap. As soon as you become expensive, they will look for reasons to dump you because profit is the bottom line. And if you're paying out of pocket, well, then you have to ensure that you've got a trustworthy doctor because he will have every incentive to fleece you. They're not interested in the poor and the sick. They're interested in the middle classes because it's their wallets they want to bleed.
So they're looking for cash flows. They're looking for rental revenues, actually. Yeah. When we really come down to the economics of it, this is rent-seeking 101. And actually, it is the most despicable form because you're preying on the most vulnerable people. If
you look at how the insurance companies in the US, like United Health, where Simon Stevens came from, who's now running...
Who's Simon Stevens?
Well, he's now running NHS England. He's got a background in the Labour Party. He worked for Tony Blair in the early 2000s. Then he went off for 10 years to work for United Health, biggest American insurance company. And then he became head of United Health Global. Now, it's all in the title. What is he there for? To expand insurance markets across the world, and that's what he's doing. But in terms of how this works...
Where was he educated?
Oxford.
What did he do at Oxford?
He did PPE.
PPE at Oxford?
Yeah.
Huh. I don't know, but there just seems to be a theme. So he's now head of NHS England. Yes. Having gone through this Americanisation, and now you think has got his eyes on filling the pockets of the insurance industry because ultimately the profit motive and the market will deliver the best gain.
If you look at United Health and you look at their subsidiary Optum, Optum has interest in 150 NHS organisations. They are already there.
I think the other interesting thing about Simon Stevens and NHS England is that NHS England is a quango. It was set up after the 2012 Health and Social Care Act, which essentially devolved the responsibility for providing health care to the nation from the Secretary of State for Health to the head of NHS England, who is Simon Stevens. So we have this very large organisation headed by a guy who has worked in the privatisation, has worked for a private insurance company in America.
As we round up and conclude, there will be people watching this at home who feel really helpless because they've just heard you flesh out this apocalyptic almost vision of what's going on, and we can't leave them in that state. What can people do? And I know we have to raise awareness, but what are practical steps that people can take now?
You can become involved as a patient. You can become involved locally. patients can actually have their voices heard. So people should find out where meetings are and go along to those meetings.
And remind us what an STP is.
Sustainability and transformation plans. These were the 44 areas that were defined by the 5-year forward view. So go along to these meetings, challenge what you're hearing, ask questions, get as much information as you possibly can. But what I would say is that the NHS is filled with dedicated, highly trained professionals who do their very, very best to look after you. We still have a health service which is providing care. We don't want anybody to lose that. We don't want any patient to suffer. The most fundamental thing that everybody watching this, every patient, every professional needs to understand is that socialised medicine is the most efficient way to provide excellent care, and we must do everything we can to preserve that.
Bob?
Yeah, we need to educate and empower people to realise there's no point kidding yourself that there's some fairy tale solution to this. You've got to get involved, you've got to get informed, get in touch with local groups, but beware that a lot of groups are there to misdirect and to waste your time.
Why is that? So explain that.
Well, you know, in the 3 or 4 years that I've been active, you find that some leaders of these groups are not choosing to fight the fight that we might win. Get informed, put pressure on these decision makers at a local level. They need to know, we know what they're up to. We need to prick their conscience, make them feel fearful that they're going to be exposed. And they're part of one of the greatest betrayals of the public interest. We need to stop this from happening.
Thank you both very much. Thank you for coming by. Thank you for putting your heads above the parapet and speaking out. It's hugely courageous, and I know that careers have been ruined because of it. You've chosen to go a different route, and we owe you a huge amount for doing that. Thank you. That's it from Renegade Inc. HQ this week. You can drop the team a mail, studio@renegadeinc.com, or tweet us @Renegade Inc. We'd love to hear from you, especially if you want to hear more about the Great NHS Heist. So do go along to the website and register. Join us next week for more insight from those people who are thinking differently. But until then, stay curious.